Amongst the anticipation for the 2021 Formula One season, there's a growing distaste within the F1 community about the increasing number of pay drivers on the grid. There are more questions than ever before about whether the right drivers are at the pinnacle of motorsport, so I thought I'd pull together my list of who should be on the 2021 F1 grid. Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The pool of drivers that I'm going to pick from are mostly those that have raced in Formula 1 over the last 5 years, plus any other drivers that I'm familiar with from other motorsport categories, so mostly F1, F2 or Formula E. I'll then take these drivers and decide which I'd put on my 20 car starting grid. Now of course a lot of these drivers will match those on the grid, but there may be some curveballs towards the end, so make sure to let me know who you'd rank where in your top 20 in the comments. And as always, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more F1 opinion content in the future. First up is Lewis Hamilton, leading the field for my dream 2021 driver lineup. He's been the dominant force in Formula 1 for the last 7 years, and is now the most decorated F1 driver of all time, so he has to be on the grid. In second is Max Verstappen, of course. Despite being just 23 years old, Verstappen's had 5 years in the sport already, and has really proved himself to be one of the best. Next up, it's got to be Charles Leclerc. The Ferrari driver had an incredible season in 2020 and will be keen to prove himself once again against a new teammate in Carlos Sainz for 2021. Then in fourth, I have the former member of the Red Bull Driver Academy in Daniel Ricciardo. The Aussie has taken Sainz's vacant seat at McLaren, and the grid would be completely different without the Aussie there. Next up, in fifth, I've gone for Carlos Sainz, a driver that particularly early on in his career was sort of in the shadow of Max Verstappen as they were teammates at Toro Rosso from 2015, but it was really the Spaniard's move to McLaren that put him on the map and earned him a move to Ferrari for 2021. Up next in sixth I've gone for Sergio Perez, who had a strong 2020 season, including of course his maiden victory at the Sakhir Grand Prix. He's gained a reputation through the turbo hybrid era of getting the most out of his car and capitalising on any opportunities that present themselves to get his midfield car onto the podium. That's not to mention his impressive ability to manage the tyres, giving him the option of alternate strategies, something that I'm sure Red Bull are hoping he can replicate in their car for 2021. In seventh, we have the 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel, who's had a tough couple of seasons in his last 2 years with Ferrari, but is still absolutely deserving of his spot on the 2021 F1 grid. Moving to Aston Martin is the perfect move for the German driver for me, a team with a fresh investment and a good outlook going into the new cost cap regulations. It seems that for me, Vettel could re-find his purpose at Aston Martin. In 8th, I've gone for Valtteri Bottas, who's been part of one of the strongest driver pairings of all time, as between him and Hamilton, the Mercedes team have won 4 double world championships in a row, and will more than likely make it 5. Bottas has been the perfect number 2, but as the Red Bull second driver conundrum has proven, you need a lot of speed and talent in order to keep fighting near the front. Yes, he isn't capable of beating Hamilton over the course of a season, but that doesn't mean he doesn't deserve a spot on the F1 grid for 2021 in my opinion. And then, just behind Bottas, is George Russell, and the Mercedes young driver is in a weird spot in his career right now where he's continually impressed for Williams and even had that chance in the Mercedes car on one occasion last year. But despite this performance, he remains at the backmarker team for 2021. And having said this, I do think that if Russell was to leave Williams without scoring a single point for the team, I think he'd have unfinished business with them. Either way, I don't see Russell staying at the Williams team for 2022, as either Mercedes or another team will take advantage of the obvious skill that he has behind the wheel. And now the final of the Q3 runners on my 2021 grid, and in at number 10 it's Fernando Alonso. For me, putting Alonso in here is tricky, as yes, he's a 2-time world champion, but both of these world championships were before Lewis Hamilton had even taken part in a Formula 1 race, which is a crazy thought. He's an undoubtedly quick driver, and for me he's capable of fighting at the front once again on occasions, but not for much longer. I feel like this comeback is a bit of a Hail Mary on the 2022 regulations. We then move on to the drivers that get knocked out in Q2, and just missing out on Q3 for me is Nico Hülkenberg. Now it must be said that drivers who get dropped from the sport are automatically seen in higher regard than some of the current drivers on the grid, but it must be said that Nico Hülkenberg is more deserving of an F1 seat than a lot of the current F1 drivers. Despite not achieving a podium finish during his F1 career, Hülkenberg well and truly delivered in those midfield cars. And yes, it's important to allow new talent to come up through this sport, but I do feel like the Hulk's career was cut short. You just have to look at his 2 race appearances in 2020 to see just how good this guy is, especially when he was drafted into a car that he hadn't raced before last minute on 2 occasions. Plus, the Racing Point team even commented that the feedback Hulkenberg gave from his 2 appearances in the car helped them to form their development. So to be able to get up to speed as well as offer that developmental feedback is the reason I have him so high up on this list. In 12th now, and I've gone for Lando Norris, who's had an impressive couple of seasons in the sport so far. He's been a part of the McLaren revival as they bring themselves back towards the front of the sport. And he's gone from being a self-confessed yes man when he first joined the sport to now being in a position where he wants to assert himself as the lead driver at the McLaren team, up against a teammate that's cast aside a couple of other drivers on this grid already, in Daniel Ricciardo. But Norris is definitely deserving of his F1 seat for me, hence I've put him in 12th. Next up, in 13th, I've got Pierre Gasly. He's a driver whose reputation has been well and truly restored following an impressive year with AlphaTauri. Gasly's proven that he's a good driver, as he did at Toro Rosso before his promotion to the Red Bull team back in 2019. He's definitely lucky to still be in the sport this year given the ruthless nature of the team's driver programme, but nonetheless, he definitely makes my driver lineup in 13th. Next up, I've gone for another Frenchman, in Jean-Eric Vergne. After 3 seasons with Toro Rosso between 2012 and 2014, he was dropped from the sport to be replaced by Max Verstappen for 2015. Now I can already hear the people in the comments saying that the reason he was dropped was because of his inability to beat Daniel Ricciardo, but he did actually beat Ricciardo in 2012 and ended up just behind him in the standings in 2013. Plus, he decidedly beat the rookie of Daniel Kvyat in 2014 before being dropped, so for me, he's definitely deserving of a seat in Formula 1. This is of course not to mention his impressive results in Formula E, where he became the sport's first 2-time world champion in the 2018-19 season. So this guy clearly has the talent and is deserving of a spot on my fantasy F1 grid. And then at the back end of Q2 for me is Esteban Ocon. The Frenchman has a huge season ahead of him in 2021, as his reputation did take a hit last year after being decidedly beaten by Daniel Ricciardo. This year he's up against Fernando Alonso, which is another tough teammate match, but he did a great job with Force India against Sergio Perez. So if he's able to find that form again this year, he's likely to solidify his place on the F1 grid. All he needs is a bit of form and his confidence will return once again, which we started to see at the back end of 2020. Now, moving into Q1 and my drivers from 16th to 20th on my Dream F1 grid. And the driver that just misses out on Q2 for me is Stoffel Vandoorne. Another driver that really wasn't given a proper chance in Formula 1. The GP2 winner was just a bit unlucky given his time with McLaren came at a time when the team was at its lowest in recent years. Plus, he was against one of the best drivers on the grid in Fernando Alonso. Talk about a tough gig to join Formula 1. After 2 seasons with the team and scoring 25 points over his Formula 1 career, he was dropped as they instead chose to take on 2 new drivers for 2019. But since then, he's joined Formula E and races for the Mercedes team. He took his first win in the championship at the end of last season and he's set to have a good year for the team once again. But for me, he's certainly deserving of an F1 seat. Moving on to 17th now, and I've picked Lance Stroll. And I think that's only happened because he's developed so much during his time in the sport already. Having completed 4 seasons so far, Stroll's learning curve has been out there for all to see. But certainly last year he did a solid job. And in the first half of the season, he looked like he could really fight for that best of the rest spot. He undoubtedly has the speed, but lacks some consistency, which I expect will come with time and experience in the sport. The next driver to be knocked out in Q1 for me is Alex Albon, a driver who's just lost his seat in Formula 1 for 2021 after being dropped by Red Bull. For me, Albon's really unlucky to not still be in Formula 1. As a standard over the last 5 to 10 years, drivers would be given at least 2 years in the Toro Rosso and now AlphaTauri car before being considered for a drive at the top team. But this guy got just 12 races at the junior team before getting his promotion midway through a season. Yes, you could argue that he got plenty of time as he lasted a year and a half in the Red Bull team, but I think he should have been dropped back to the junior team rather than being cast aside. And of course I do understand that the decisions were made for the AlphaTauri seats before he was dropped from the Red Bull team. One thing I would say though is that I don't think this is the last we'll see of Alex Albon in Formula 1. He showed glimpses of what he could achieve in the sport, and I think he'll be missed from the F1 grid this year. In 19th it's Mick Schumacher, and he's the last entry on this list who's actually a part of the F1 grid for 2021. Schumacher's definitely ready to join the pinnacle of motorsport after an impressive Formula 2 championship winning campaign in 2020. And although he may have a challenging first year in the sport, he definitely deserves to be on the grid, and I expect he'll be here for a while yet, given his significant backing from Ferrari. And then finally, taking the 20th spot on my dream F1 grid, I've gone for Nick de Vries, who's the teammate of Stoffel Vandoorne at Mercedes in Formula E. Now, I don't know whether he's definitely better than some of the drivers that didn't make this list, but this guy's the Formula 2 champion from 2019, and I think it's a real shame that he never really got a shot in Formula 1. He's currently racing for Formula E at the Mercedes team, and he got off to a great start in Diriyah last weekend by winning the opening round of the season. He's definitely got talent, but just because he didn't have enough financial backing, he never quite made it to Formula 1. And I think to have achieved what he did in Formula 2 without this backing is all the more impressive. So that's my 20 drivers that would make my 2021 driver lineup if it was up to me. 15 of these drivers do indeed feature on the actual 2021 F1 grid, so that's not too bad, I suppose. It shows that while there are some pay drivers, they don't necessarily dominate the F1 grid. And of course, some drivers on this list, like Sergio Perez and Lance Stroll, are of course pay drivers that still make my top 20. Now of course there are many reasons why pay drivers are needed, and I'm sure there's a huge amount of lost talent coming from junior formulas that simply don't get the investment to even make it into a karting championship, let alone a formula car. But these are my selections for this season. In terms of those who missed out, we have the obvious omissions of the drivers that are racing in 2021, including Kimi Raikkonen, Antonio Giovinazzi, Yuki Tsunoda, and of course Nicholas Latifi. I also carefully considered a few others, including Callum Ilott, Pascal Wehrlein, Kevin Magnussen, Romain Grosjean, and Daniel Kvyat. But I think I'm happy with my overall selections, although it's so close between the drivers towards the back end of the grid that my selections could change every week. So who did I get wrong, and who should have made it instead? I'm sure there's a huge amount of talent that I've missed, so do let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and if you've watched this far, then please leave the video a like and consider subscribing for more F1 opinion content in the future.